Hi all, welcome back to another episode of the Pomodo Startup Journey podcast. It's been a few weeks since I last recorded, so there's a fair few bits to update you on. We have a new starter, we have a new podcast that's ready to launch next week, which is very exciting. Oh, and the kids are back in lockdown, so yeah, back to being a part-time teacher it is for me then. So let's start with a new podcast, shall we? It's called Sports Virgins, and in it we have two people that know absolutely nothing about sport, discussing the weekly sports news and hopefully learning a thing or two about the world of sport. So it's a sports comedy podcast, and the two people we have in it are comedian Matt Richardson and radio DJ Amy Vose. We recorded a pilot last week, and do you know what? It went a lot better than I thought. Well, obviously, I hoped it would be really funny and it would work really well. That's why I came up with the idea, I suppose. But to see it come out exactly how I had planned, if not a little bit better, was awesome. So I'm absolutely delighted about that. The pilot's a bit longer than what the episodes will be moving on. It's just over an hour overall, which is too long, but we deliberately made it longer. I wanted to test a few things so that we could understand what works and what doesn't, and we now have a pretty good idea for how we can structure the format next time. We've had some belting quotes from it too so far. Amy thought that Roger Federer was Spanish because he's really hairy. And Matt seemed to think that Roger Moore played for England in the 1966 World Cup final. So hopefully we'll have some more sporting stupidity like that in the episodes to come. The other test I wanted to look at during the pilot was the third person in it. The setup is that we have the two sports novices, Amy and Matt, then one sports expert. But I wasn't sure what kind of personality we needed for that. Do we need a comedian or someone a bit dry, serious to complement the other two? Do we need this person to be well known or not? Or do we get a sports person even? So those are the things I wanted to test. For the pilot, I stepped in and played this role, and the chemistry was actually quite good. So we've decided to stick with that for the time being. Being that I am a total sports geek, I feel as though I can play that role well enough. And from the pilot, I figured that the main draws are definitely Matt and Amy, and they will completely dominate the airtime, so we don't really need an absolute superstar for this third role. And to be honest, having one less talent to deal with is always good from a logistics perspective anyway. So we'll see how this one goes. The aim is to release on the first week of November and keep this going on a weekly basis. It's one of those where I don't think it's going to be massive straight off the bat. It doesn't have huge names, which tends to be the prerequisite for an immediate hit these days. Although also, it's not like they are complete unknowns either, and they are both professional broadcasters and entertainers. So my hope with this is that it, gathers a bit of a cult following, grows in momentum, and will become a bit of a slow burn hit for us in the future. We've also been recording a lot of the Laid Bear podcast that I mentioned to you a couple of episodes ago. The annoying thing here is that we're going to have to change the bloody name of this again. Deja vu from the old company name debacle at the very beginning. Here we go again. But at least with this, we do have a good few weeks before this will be due to release. So there's no immediate rush here. We've got plenty of time to find a solution. And the way in which we've recorded it means that we can't easily change the name without anyone really knowing, so that's all good. The reason why we have to change the name is that there's already a podcast called Laid Bear. It's about sex, and it's pretty much the crudest and rudest podcast I've ever heard. And I listen to Couples Quarantine every week, so not the kind of podcast that we want this to be confused with. But the good thing is that the recordings have all been going really well, and we've spoken to some really inspirational sports people with fantastic stories to tell over the last couple of weeks. One example being the swimmer Siobhan Marie O'Connor. So she won silver for Great Britain at the Rio Olympics in 2016, which in itself is an incredible achievement, but she did so while suffering from ulcerative colitis. I won't go into her story here, you'll have to listen to the podcast for that, but when talking to her, I was thinking that she is exactly the type of role model that I want my daughters to have in life, so I'm glad that she agreed to be on that. Couples Quarantine is still going strong. It's now at nearly 150,000 downloads, which is great. We now have a really loyal audience that listens every single week, and they love the content. After a few negative reviews at the very beginning from people that this kind of podcast just isn't really suited for, which is fine, although I don't really know why these people feel the need to say so if they don't find the content interesting. But we're now getting a steady stream of really positive comments and reviews from people that absolutely love James and Chloe's honesty. We haven't made much progress on the monetization with this yet, though. We got a couple of brands involved at the very beginning, but the content is definitely a bit less brand safe than I thought. But having said that, it does does take time to monetize podcasts. If you look at something like Shagged, Married, Annoyed, which is one of the biggest podcasts in the UK today, it took them around 50 episodes to get a sponsor, and it became a bit of an ongoing joke as part of the content. So, podcast creators just need to be patient. It takes time to build an audience before we can start to monetize effectively. And Outside the Box is still live too. That's been a really good learning curve for us. We've got a great host in Becky Ives, who's an excellent interviewer. The content is really interesting. The cause is a positive one in supporting women in sport. And we've had some really big name guests too, like Phil Neville, Jules Breach, Sian Massey Ellis. And even her episode was released a few days after the little incident with Sergio Aguero. So she was in the media a lot that week, and the podcast even made it onto the Mail Online as a result, which was, pretty cool. But even with all that, it still hasn't managed to get a lot of listeners. It just goes to show that even with a really good podcast, the fact is that there are thousands of good podcasts out there. And, more often than not, there are hundreds or many podcasts that are very similar to yours, even though you think is quite unique. Now, we are planning to release a lot more podcasts that will be similar to this in that they won't have big name talent to carry it. So this has been a really good learning experience in terms of knowing what we need to do to scale those. It goes back to what I was saying on the last episode about working with talent, how it's the double-edged sword of, needing well-known talent in order to cut through initially in the podcast landscape, but also how working with talent, or rather relying on talent, can also be quite difficult. The big name sports that I mentioned at the beginning of this episode is Ronnie O'Sullivan. I'm super excited about this one. This can be huge for my business. For those that don't know who Ronnie is, he's the greatest snooker player ever, the current world champion, and also he's not shy of an opinion or two, which generally goes down quite well for a podcast. So I've got quite high hopes for this one. The challenge for this has been that Ronnie is still actively competing in snooker. So this podcast is just not quite a priority for him right now. And I totally understand that. His career is the number one most important thing. But for me, this is my new life. This is my priority. And I'm currently relying on things like this to build my business, which kind of puts me in a rather vulnerable position. I want to move as fast as possible, but it's not really up to me. It's out of my hands. I just have to be patient and be ready to go whenever they are ready to move. But fingers crossed, we'll start recording this over the next couple of weeks. And my hope is that we can get this released before the end of the year. There's actually another UK sports name on the cards too, arguably bigger than Ronnie, but that's further away from being confirmed, so I won't mention anything more about that right now. I don't want to jinx things. But that's another example of the difficulty in working with talent. With Sports Virgins, we got that up and running in a couple of weeks and moved incredibly fast with that. But the bigger the name, the more people are involved, and generally the slower everything moves. I just need to be patient. So those are the main updates on the content side, really. And, overall, I'm pretty happy with where we're at. I mentioned the new starter at the beginning, and we had a new guy called Dan Sleeth starting a couple of weeks ago. Dan had worked with me at Spotify for many years, so we've got a really good working relationship. And I was delighted that he wanted to join. To be honest, I didn't think I could be able to afford someone like him so early, but he was searching for a new challenge and wanted to be part of growing a business, and he was willing to take a bit of a hit as well, which is good, and take a bit of a gamble on a new venture. His primary role will be to lead all the sponsorship conversations, but the big appeal for me, beyond knowing his capabilities in that field, was that he's a bit of an all-rounder, very creative, and someone I know that I can trust. We don't have an office yet, and given the current global situation, that's clearly not going to happen for a while. So it's a bit tricky when it's just the two of us and we're not together. But the plan is to get together in person once a week in London somewhere, probably just hanging out in hotel lobbies and coffee shops for a while, just trying to cut down on any outgoings. And in the meantime, it's back to good old Google Hangouts. At least I have someone to hang out with, albeit virtually these days anyway. And already it's been great to have someone focus on those sponsorship conversations. I personally have felt so much freer to just focus on other parts of the business over the last couple of weeks, which has been great. On the one side, the main focus has to be on building the content. Without content, we've got nothing to monetize. But also, with these two big shows coming up, we really need to find some sponsors for those. So definitely feeling the pressure on those, but with Dan on board, I'm confident we can get things going on that front. And then for me, I can put a lot more thought into the long-term strategy, building content, exploring partnerships, and getting things like our marketing strategy a bit more fleshed out. I think I mentioned the PR work we've done on a previous episode, which is still going to be an integral part of what we're doing. But now that we have some bigger shows launching, I want to take the marketing side to the next level. Social media will play a big part here, both leveraging the following of the talent as well as some paid-for activity. But I'm also going to run a few tests with Spotify Ad Studio, which is their self-serve advertising platform. And that will allow us to target a pretty laser-focused audience group on Spotify. For example, people who have listened to a sports podcast in the last month, which would be great. Thankfully, I know all about Ad Studio, so I'm looking forward to seeing the results of that, although it will be a bit weird dealing with it from the other side. Then the other consideration for me is to build the profile of Pomodo as a company. Now, I don't really have the ambition to make Pomodo a big consumer-facing brand. At the end of the day, people will be listening to the podcast on Apple and Spotify, so they don't need to go to Pomodo as a destination. The talent in the podcast themselves are hopefully going to be quite well-known people, so they will have their own following and people will come to listen to them. And also the podcast themselves will become the consumer-facing brand that we'll also build an audience for. But if I can build a following on the Pomodo channels itself, whether that's social media or a newsletter, then we can leverage that to build a base audience for any new show that launches. We already have a newsletter sign-up functionality on the website, and we have things like social media handles set up. But to be honest with you, things have been so manic that I've just totally ignored these and haven't really done anything with them since I set them up at the very beginning. But now that I have a bit more time, that's going to be the next task for me now to really get these things sorted and ironed out. So that's it from me this time. Lots going on, and please keep a lookout for sports versions when that launches. Whether you're a sports fan or not, hopefully you'll find it very funny. I know that from my perspective, and I might be biased here, but when I was listening into the recordings, I genuinely laughed out loud multiple times. So fingers crossed on that one. And, as usual, any likes, shares, comments, reviews, etc. for any new show is always massively appreciated. So yeah, anything you can do there, thanks very much. Thank you for listening to my startup journey and for all your support so far. Please subscribe, share, and give us a nice little 5-star rating and even a cheeky little review if you feel like it. Don't forget that Couples Quarantine with James Haskell and Chloe Madeley has new episodes releasing every Monday. So if you want to hear their hilarious take on certain relationship-based topics, then check that out. And please check out Sports Virgins too, our brand new comedy sports podcast that will help bring all you sports novices up to speed and give you a bit of a giggle whilst doing so.